everyone, welcome. For those of you who are here in the room, please make sure you grab lunch, grab a seat wherever. I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. I am Sarah Brewer. I co-direct our team core at Accords, which is our training, education, and mentorship program. I wanna welcome you all today to our education seminar. For those of you who are not familiar, a little bit about Accords. We are supported by the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Children's Hospital Colorado. We're something of a unique one-stop shop for faculty who are conducting pragmatic research to receive various types of services and supports for their grants and projects, along with incredible mentorship, training, and education in health services research. And I specifically want to call out the second bullet point, our strong methodological cores and programs. A few of those have been partnering to bring this Learning Health Systems series to life this year. So our Pragmatic Trials core, our Economic Analysis core, and our Learning Health Systems core. So thank you so much for all three of them partnering to bring Dr. Kripalani here today. A few upcoming events I want to highlight for everyone. In just a couple weeks, we will be wrapping up our Transforming and Advancing a Learning Health System, Multiple Perspectives for Mutual Gain series with Dr. Jean Kuttner. On April 4th, we have our Community Engagement Showcase in partnership with our CCTSI Community Engagement and Health Equity Core. April 30th and May 1st, we are offering our D&I workshop this year titled Strengthening the Application of Theories, Models, and Frameworks in Implementation Research. We provided a workshop similar to this in November 2023 and heard great feedback, and we were really excited to offer it again in partnership with our D&I core. On May 12th, we are wrapping up our Emerging Topics in Digital Health and Clinical Informatics with guest Matt Lascalzo from City of Hope. And finally, June 4th and 5th, we have the Colorado Pragmatic Research in Health Conference here on the Anschutz campus. So we hope to see you there, and registration is open on our website. Okay, just a couple of housekeeping items before I hand over the floor. If you are on Zoom, please go ahead and use the chat throughout the seminar today. I will be monitoring so we can bring those forward for Q&A at the end of the hour. We will have time for Q&A, so hold your questions, and we hope to have a lively discussion. And then finally, there are evaluations here in the room, and if you're on Zoom, we'll share those in the chat toward the end of the hour. We really value your feedback on our series, and we hope that you'll share any ideas or feedback that you have. Okay. Today's seminar is part of our Transforming and Advancing a Learning Health System, Multiple Perspectives for Mutual Gain, and it's the fourth in our series this year. And I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Kripalani to share with us today. Sunil Kripalani is a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University Health Center, where he directs the Center for Health Services Research and serves as vice president for Health System Science. He previously founded the Center for Clinical Quality and Implementation Research and continues to lead several research and training programs in implementation science and learning health systems, dedicated to improving healthcare delivery, health outcomes by optimizing quality, value, equity, and patient-centered care. He's an applied implementation scientist and has expertise in improving transitions of care for hospital patients with a focus in health literacy, social determinants of health, care coordination, and medication safety. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kripalani as he presents Building Synergy Across Academic and Operational Programs in a Learning Health System. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. It's really been a treat to get to reconnect with old friends and make new colleagues here. I have always had tremendous respect for the group at Accords, and really pleased to share some of the work that we've been doing at Vanderbilt so that we can continue to learn from each other. I know I've already learned a lot during this visit. So my hope is to share with you today really a portfolio of the programs we have to support learning health system work at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And I thought we could do that by just beginning with some basic premise behind the learning health system in case any in the audience are less familiar with the major functions of a learning health system. I'm then going to talk about some examples of embedded research and clinical operations that we've been doing and how we use those as ways of building partnership between our researchers and the clinical enterprise. And then I would like to focus most of the time on discussing key infrastructure components that really enable that collaboration as we've continued to build our learning health system, which is still growing. So let's start with why the heck do we need a learning health system? Well, there are questions that come up in clinical practice all the time. So I practice as a hospitalist, and the kinds of questions that might come up are, what are the best ventilator settings for a patient? Or what antibiotic regimen should I use for these patients? Sometimes we can go to the literature to find the answer to these questions, but sometimes the literature is unclear and we want to generate evidence that's going to be directly applicable to our patients. And that's one of the goals of a learning health system. The other reason we need a learning health system is that the old way of doing things takes forever. The traditional scientific pipeline involves discovery science, slowly progressing to the creation of evidence, which is then replicated in subsequent studies. And some of it eventually makes its way to patient care, but along the way, there's an enormous amount of waste, missed opportunities, and often lack of engaging patients in this process to focus on those kinds of things that are important to them. The gap between what's been shown in the scientific literature and what we're actually able to implement in practice is only getting bigger. There's just an absolute explosion of scientific research, and the implementation gap grows every day between that and what we actually carry out in practice. And that's another reason why we need a different model. So the National Academy of Medicine introduced the concept of learning health systems to the scientific community as really a culture which involves incentives and leadership and ties together the generation of evidence, application to patient care, all in a process in which evidence is generated and we continue to learn in the process of delivering patient care. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality visualizes this a bit differently and a little bit more succinctly by saying that a learning health system is one in which internal data and experience are integrated with external evidence and that knowledge is put into practice. Now you might be asking yourself, shouldn't we have always been doing this as a health system? Yes, but that's not the way our health systems have necessarily been set up. So characteristics of an effective learning health system are shown on this slide. There has to be learning. You got to capture events, capture data, and be aware of the context in which that information is coming. We need to be able to do things rapidly. The traditional cycle of applying for a grant, waiting 2 years till it gets funded, 5 years to carry out the work, then another 5 years to replicate it or spread it, and then eventually it makes its way into practice is not quick enough. We need to do things continuously in a cyclic activity that feeds on itself and have an infrastructure to support all of this so that it's part of the culture. What a learning health system is not is coming up with a question, collecting and analyzing data, publishing it, and then declaring mission accomplished. If we complete the cycle where we bring that evidence back into our patient care and use it to generate the next question, now we're starting to look more like a learning health system. So in order to do this, we need certain capabilities. We've got to be able to gather and integrate data. We need to be able to do it quickly. We can't wait 2 years for data to become available. We need it in real time. We need to be able to design and implement interventions in a way that makes sense. We need to be able to do things iteratively, borrowing from the field of quality improvement. Engage patients and health system stakeholders in the process so that the information is relevant to them. This is all new, so we need ethics and privacy safeguards. When we're doing embedded research in the context of care, what can be done with consent? What can be done without consent, for example? Healthcare providers need to be trained in being part of this whole system so that they're participants in capturing some of the data and turning those discoveries back into usual practice. And we need policies and governance. And if we do all this right, we'll do it in a way that's scalable and sustainable. But it's quite a lot. So let's move on to the next part. I'd like to share with you all some examples of research that we've been doing at my medical center which helps us bridge the clinical and operational part of our enterprise with the research expertise. The first thing that I'd like to draw attention to is there's not one methodology. Part of the way we're able to foster relationships with different clinical programs is to be flexible. There are certain methods which would fit within the culture of a particular part of our healthcare delivery system that wouldn't fit within the culture of another part. There are initiatives that require observational study or retrospective analysis. We might need to use quality improvement methods. We might be able to do a quasi-experimental trial, or in certain circumstances, a randomized controlled trial. And we might like to incorporate implementation science into all of this. And so in working with our health system in a flexible way, we can, over time, build a culture of collaboration rather than coming into it with a dogmatic academic approach of we have to do it a certain way. So what I'd like to do is just share some examples of work, and I'll try to call out the ways in which we adapt. We chose a method to be appropriate to the clinical context, and in the process, built that relationship. So let's start with improvement science. So for our students of quality improvement, this IHI model for improvement will be very familiar. The fundamental principle here is we need to know what we're trying to accomplish, how to measure it, and then do iterative cycles of improvement. The plan, do, study, act cycle. Now you may say, well, what's the science there? I thought this was just to try things out and see what works. Well, when you start doing this over time and you're very deliberate about it, and the complexity of the interventions grow, and you're adapting things based on what you've learned before, and you're using principles about how to do this effectively and engage champions and stakeholders and data sources, now we're starting to turn this into a science. And so there may be certain interventions which are appropriate to evaluate using these kinds of approaches from quality improvement and improvement science to be part of the learning health system collaboration. The one example I'll share here is enhanced recovery after surgery. So this is an evidence-based process by which patients' functional status and other considerations are taken into account even before they receive surgery. And attention is given to all of those factors to help enhance patients' progression through recovery, and with the goal of having a quick return to a good functional status after that surgery. So it's an evidence-based approach, and we worked with our surgical sciences departments to implement this approach across multiple surgical lines. Now, this was not a context where it would have been appropriate to do a randomized controlled trial, for example, of does ARS work or does it not work? Because everybody had bought into the idea that this was important. We needed to do it across the clinical programs, but we didn't exactly know how to get it fully integrated into operations. And so here the approach that fit best was to do iterative improvement cycles, which were done in parallel across 7 different surgical lines, but with a steering committee that reviewed regularly the results that were being achieved, the processes, and provided executive level support for the next cycle of improvement. And over time, between 2017 and 2022, as shown in this graph, there was a move towards a higher level of performance of this evidence-based bundle of care, such that when an evaluation was done, at least within one of the surgical lines, there was a demonstrated reduction in postoperative complications as well as length of stay, which were part of the goals of this program. There are other contexts where we might be able to do a quasi-experimental study, and so this is an example of a trial we did in the early days of the COVID pandemic. It was known prior to this that when patients were in the ICU on a mechanical ventilator, and if you turn them on their stomach, you were better able to deliver oxygen to their lungs. And so it made sense if somebody's in the hospital and they need oxygen, like a lot of people did during the early days of COVID especially, well, we should turn them on their stomachs. And of course, that evidence would translate. And so that was actually standard practice in a lot of medical centers. Well, some of our physicians, our pulmonary doctors in our hospital have said, well, they're not so sure. Let's do a study. This is an example of a question that came up at the bedside for which there wasn't good evidence already. And so we did a quasi-experimental study in which patients were allocated based on their medical record number. Technically, they were not randomized, but Odd numbers went this way, even numbers went that way. And they were given instructions about either proning, laying on their stomach, or not. If they were hospitalized with COVID and needed oxygen, but not to the point of being on a mechanical ventilator. So we were generating evidence in the context of our usual practice here. The reason we chose this design was because it was acceptable. It was feasible to carry out. The physician said, yeah, I could go for that. You can randomize our patients. And so there was a meeting with all the hospitalists, with all the pulmonary critical care docs, with all the emergency physicians to get group level buy-in so that we could conduct this trial in hospitalized patients. And over a period of just less than a year, quite a bit less than a year, we were able to accrue a large number of patients and answer this question about, does oxygenation actually improve if you instruct patients to lay on their belly or not? And we found out basically the answer was there's no difference. Now, people doubted this, but then another study came out and showed the same thing. And then another one, and then another one. And then a meta-analysis eventually showed that, indeed, there's no benefit to this practice. But as soon as this study result was completed, we changed our clinical practice at our medical center. We stopped proning patients because we had generated evidence within our patient context, which was generated with a broad, diverse set of patients with buy-in of the clinicians that were taking care of those people. So all the key ingredients were there for rapid translation into clinical practice immediately upon results of this. We do a lot of work in pragmatic clinical trials in our medical center. And I'd like to just describe briefly some of the differences between a pragmatic clinical trial and a typical clinical trial. And then I'll give you a couple of examples. A pragmatic trial is one in which we're doing it in a broad group of patients in the context of actual clinical practice. The patients in the study are intentionally heterogeneous to maximize generalizability. We try to do it pretty quickly without a heavy burden on people caring for the patients. It's usually a minimal cost or no cost intervention. Often we're testing 2 reasonably acceptable clinical treatments, which you might randomly get depending on which doctor is taking care of you. So why not randomize the patient to get one or the other? So you might see some pragmatic clinical trials where the randomization occurs at the patient level. So if you can feasibly carry that out based on your clinical environment, again, this is in consultation with the people providing the care, you can randomize patients to intervention A or B and then follow them. There may be other clinical contexts in which you can't do that. Maybe you want to test an intervention in the context of a clinic, and you've got 12 clinics, and you can't treat patients differently within a clinic, so you randomize at the clinic level, or the nursing unit level. And these cluster randomized controlled trials, depending on the clinical context, can be another effective way to carry out that research embedded in clinical practice. Maybe there's a stepped wedge design that's appropriate. So in a scenario like this, we would consult with the health system, and I'll give you an example of this. If ultimately we want to roll out a program across multiple areas, and everybody wants to get it eventually, we could do it in a way that is randomizing the order of rollout, and each unit of randomization serves as its own control. So over time, you have a bunch of before-after studies, but statistically it's very powerful for answering the questions about the effectiveness of that intervention. And I'm going to skip that. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. So these are examples of ways in which we've tried to generate scientific evidence within the context of clinical care as part of our learning health system. So as a hospitalist, one of the questions we often have is, which antibiotic should I use for empiric treatment? And there are 2 commonly used antibiotics when we need to cover certain bacteria. Well, again, depending on who's caring for you as a patient, you might get one or the other, just based on the preferences of that person providing care. But we constructed a randomized controlled trial called ACORN, in which we got buy-in from the large groups of physicians who are caring for these patients. And part of that was trying to figure out, could we feasibly do patient level randomization? Or did we need to randomize at the level of the physician caring for the patient or the nursing unit? And through some discussions with those stakeholders, we figured out that we could do patient level randomization, which is just a little easier, statistically very powerful, and it's easy to interpret the results. So we built an EHR tool such that when patients met certain criteria, um, basically they were in the hospital with an infection and they got prescribed one of these two antibiotics by their physician, a pop-up came up and said, hey, your patient's actually eligible for this study. Can we randomize them to either this antibiotic or that one? Click a button if you're okay with that. That was it. That was all the work that the physicians had to do. They had already provided group level buy-in that this was acceptable to them. We knew that these were two antibiotics that could either be used. And so our IRB approved this as a study which did not require patient level informed consent because we were testing two comparable standards of care. We developed some clinical outcomes, again in consultation with the clinical stakeholders. They wanted to know not only about the treatment effectiveness, but also a couple of side effects that each of these antibiotics were known for. One, mental status changes, the other, kidney problems. So we made sure to include those outcomes in the study because they mattered to the group of people who would be ultimately using the results of this trial. And so that was another way of bridging the research method with input from the clinical environment. And what we found is that, first of all, we were able to randomize 2,500 or so patients in this study in about a year's time. It was very powerful to be able to do things like this. There was more than a 90% acceptance of randomizing the patients into the trial. And all the data for the study outcomes were harvested electronically. That was another key feature of a pragmatic trial. We don't want to go around doing chart level abstraction, too much work. This is totally unfunded research, no external grant for this, so you got to do it quick and cheap, but very powerful. And it turns out there was actually no significant difference in the treatment outcomes or in the rate of these two adverse effects that physicians are typically concerned about with these antibiotics. Now back to that example of a step wedge trial. So in this context, there was an interest in addressing the problem of penicillin allergies. Who in the room has ever been told that you have a penicillin allergy? Just raise your hand. That's actually few. Across the board, it's about 15% of patients or adults have been told that they have a penicillin allergy, but a lot of times it wasn't really. Whatever infection they had at the beginning might have actually caused that rash that made their parent think that they have a penicillin allergy. But there's a lot of people running around thinking they have a penicillin allergy. And that affects the antibiotics that they end up getting because you avoid the penicillins. And sometimes inappropriately, you avoid the cephalosporins, even though that's a different drug class. And so the allergist who worked on this study, who led this study, his life mission is to address these alleged allergies. And he had done a proof of concept randomized controlled trial in our ICUs in which he put in place a protocol to see by history, does somebody look like they're low risk for having a true penicillin allergy? And then give them a test dose of a penicillin, amoxicillin, and see what happens. And if they're fine, they don't really have an allergy. Now, he did this in the ICU where there's a lot of ventilatory equipment. People are used to resuscitating people. The nurses were all cool with this. The physicians were like, yeah, go ahead. We can handle it. But when it came time to spread this across the entire hospital, different story. So here we had to engage the nurses, the clinical stakeholders. Like, how comfortable are you with giving a penicillin to somebody who thinks they have a penicillin allergy? You guys are going to be the ones responsible for dealing with consequences. You know, can we do this? So they're like, yeah, but if you give us enough training on how to do it, if you make it easy and quick for us to do the allergy screen. And so this was going to take a little bit of work. You couldn't just turn this on across the whole hospital. This was a scenario where each nursing unit needed to be brought on board with some education, implementation of the protocol, engagement of the pharmacist, training of the nurses, et cetera. And this was a perfect example of needing to do something slowly over time so that the team leading it could work through all the different nursing units. And what a great setup for a step-wage randomized control trial. So we randomized the order of nursing units that would go and conducted this trial. And so this is under review right now, but the bottom line is that it was safe to do this in a general hospital population. And the primary outcome was if you randomize patients or units to this protocol, can you effectively delabel someone? Do they then subsequently end up getting some penicillins if that's indicated as part of their treatment? And does their allergy label actually stay out of their chart in the future? Or is there recidivism and somebody says, oh, wait a minute, somebody must have removed this by mistake? So all of those outcomes were part of the study, and we demonstrated that this was feasible to carry out because of that partnership and engaging the clinical care delivery system in being actively involved in this research study design and the way it was carried out. The last example I'm going to give is more on the implementation side. This is a trial I'm doing right now. It's funded by NIH. The other examples I gave were actually unfunded studies. They were supported in part by some infrastructure we have, largely through our CTSA. But this one's externally funded, and it's an effort to improve the discharge of patients from the emergency department who are coming in with heart failure. Commonly, about 80 to 90% of people who have heart failure and come into the emergency department will get admitted. And interestingly, that's not the case at every hospital, but at ours it is. And one of my colleagues had developed a validated prediction model to identify which of those patients might be at low risk of adverse outcomes. And so we worked across 10 emergency departments to design an implementation study. We began with doing contextual inquiry, tailoring our implementation strategies, and rolling them out in a very organized way. And we're trying to see what effect it has when we bundle that validated prediction model into a clinical decision support tool that our emergency department physicians helped us design, and our human factors engineers helped us design. And we build this into their workflow in Epic so that when they have a patient with heart failure in real time, they're given a risk score for that patient, and they're put in the context of all comers. And the low-risk patients are identified such that the physician is asked to consider whether that patient's appropriate for discharge, actually. For my implementation science people in the audience, here and virtually, we did the full bore planning of implementation strategies here. Yeah, this was a 5-year R01, so you got to do it. And we went through a very deliberate process, which I won't go through for the sake of time, but it was a lot of engagement of the people on the front lines to make this work be done in a way that was clinically acceptable, that took into account the incredibly busy workflows in the emergency department. We did site visits to learn about how they typically implement new evidence into their practice, did a lot of planning, and in the implementation phase, a lot of monitoring. So that we can continue to give tweaks to our intervention to optimize its adoption into practice if we see things aren't going the way we like. We laid all this out in a timeline, and this was very intentionally planned across sites. One of the challenges in a study like this was doing comparable work across 10 different emergency departments. And so we had to be very specific about what it meant to do a particular implementation strategy. Who is the actor? Who is the target? Why are you doing it? How long are you spending on it? And this approach will be very familiar to the implementation scientists here. So across all these examples, we really tried to engage the people who were going to be part of the frontline delivery of care to bring the research to them in as rigorous a way possible that would fit the realities of that environment and allow the research questions to be answered, and do it in a way that improves care in the process and where we're poised to generalize from the result of that study and implement the findings in routine care. So the last thing I'd like to share with you all is what are some of the infrastructure components that have helped enable this work over time. This is not something that comes up overnight. I traced the roots back to 2000. I was not at Vanderbilt at that time. In fact, I was just finishing my residency. But at that time, the Center for Health Services Research was founded, and the Nashville VA Quality Scholars Program was initiated. Actually, nationally, all the VA Quality Scholars programs were initiated in that year. And that's a postdoctoral training program in improvement and implementation science. And so those two initiatives really started developing a cadre of people who were trained in these general methods of improvement and implementation science, as well as a research infrastructure to support investigator-initiated research broadly in health services research. Fast forward about 14 years. By this point, we've got a lot of people across our medical center who completed training, who are doing research on healthcare delivery, but largely, again, investigator-initiated work. It felt like it was a good time to build an academic home for implementation science. So that's when we founded the Center for Clinical Quality and Implementation Research. A couple years later, we developed a core. And then the next year, our CTSA decided to write into its application a module to support pragmatic clinical trials. That same year, we got a K-12 program, which I know Colorado had as well, from NHLBI, to support training of faculty scientists interested in T4 translational research. And from that training grant, we were able to successfully compete for several others. Another K-12 from ARC, a T32 from ARC, and most recently a T32 from NHLBI. We started recognizing that there's an ability to deliver core curricular elements across what's now a large group of trainees, and we started building those educational programs. And then in 2023, with a lot of things already in place, we did a strategic planning exercise, and I'll share that with you in some detail, and have really launched the next phase of this work. So let's talk about that. So just a little bit about HSR. I think it's largely analogous to Accords. It's a large research center, primarily supports investigator-initiated work. We have 3 cores in improvement and implementation science, qualitative research, and health communication. Largely faculty who are affiliated with the center are doing their own PI-led research, but in the general space of patient outcomes and healthcare delivery. HSR is actually an umbrella research center. It's what we call a Big C center, and within it there are about 20 other centers and programs, one of which is the Center for Clinical Quality and Implementation Research. So again, this is our home for implementation science. We've got about 40 faculty who are part of this, and most of them are doing their own investigator-initiated work in implementation science. But a lot of that ends up being things that involve our own health system. So through those investigator-initiated grants, there's often partnering with somebody or some clinical area within the health system. And while that is and may feel like a one-off, you start accumulating one-offs. And so we've been doing this for about 11 years now. And we've got a pretty good collection of projects that have been done by investigators involving scientific principles, but carried out in some way in our clinical footprint. Our center supports these training programs that I mentioned. Here's all of them listed in aggregate. Some are at the faculty level and some are at the postdoctoral level. There's regular seminars and MPH classes to support those trainees too. Our core service provides consultation freely to anybody who requests it. We provide a little bit of hard money support to enable that. And it's what you would expect, consultation in use of implementation science principles, frameworks, and such. Planning and mixed methods evaluation. Our core is not currently resourced to carry out those evaluations, but if somebody wants to prepare a grant, for example, and write in the core services or write in some of the people as investigators, they can certainly do that. I want to briefly describe our infrastructure for pragmatic trials. Again, this was developed initially through support from our CTSA. And so there's an opportunity to apply for a module, which is about $300,000. within the CTSA budget. And so that was started in 2017, and we've kept it in our renewal application. And so what this platform for pragmatic trials has done is create an infrastructure in which people, usually scientific investigators, can bring an idea, get it workshopped, and then work towards creating an executive summary that's then presented to a large group, which includes health system leaders, for their support. The existence of this program provided a place where we would literally bring together the directors of our CTSA and our health system CEOs and other C-suite leaders to be part of some meetings to hear about projects and to provide some input on the relevance of that project to the health system. But by and large, these are investigator-initiated things, not necessarily driven by health system topics. But the infrastructure has allowed the performance of these trials very efficiently and cost-effectively over time. Shifting gears a bit, I mentioned educational programs. Not going to spend too much time on this part, but with a number of programs, we are able to create some shared infrastructure. And one of the things we've recognized is that we can fill gaps in offerings. If there's a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship that's available, but people don't have 2 years, what do you do in that circumstance? I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. But across all these programs, we really try to instill learning health system competencies. Increasingly, we've tried to move our training programs away from allowing the trainees to pursue whatever they want to pursue, and instead follow a set of competencies, these are from ARC, and work on projects that have already been endorsed as important by the health system. So they gain familiarity with working on priority topics, they gain connections to health system leaders, and there's the opportunity to generate evidence and affect change more rapidly when we're working on something that's already deemed important. So I'm going to tell you about a few of these training programs because they've really played a key role in fostering this culture that supports a learning health system and the bridging of the clinical and academic entities. So the VA Quality Scholars is now in its 25th year. It supports 2 to 3 postdocs per year, and they receive training in health services research, improvement and implementation science, and leadership. And they're actually required to do a quality improvement project in the context of the VA and a priority area at the VA. And not everybody has 2 years to spend on a postdoc, but maybe they want to learn about the core principles of quality improvement. So at our children's hospital in 2016, the leaders created a year-long course called Quality Academy. Unlike the postdoctoral research fellowship, this is a training program directed towards health system leaders, people who were running a clinical program, for example, or responsible for managing a big part of the healthcare delivery system within our children's hospital and clinics were ideal candidates for this program. So in a format which include monthly didactic sessions, which cover the basics of quality improvement and improvement science, as well as the performance of a mentored quality improvement project, people in this program get to learn about the fundamentals of effecting change in practice and carrying out a project, usually from their own area in which they're already working. This was a program designed to be in person, and it initially had a capacity of about 12 to 15 people. They expanded it to 20 or 25 people and opened it up beyond Children's Hospital because there was such a demand for this training. But still, a lot of people said, I don't have a year. What do you do then? Or I can't come in person because now we're a big regional health system. What do you do if you're in a community hospital 50 miles away? So last year we created another program called Essentials in Quality Improvement. And this was done in partnership with our Senior Vice President for Quality and Safety. It's basically a trimmed down version of Quality Academy. The audience is health system leaders at sort of the mid-management level. Often people who find themselves in a role like in charge of a clinic or leading nursing education, or the medical director of a primary care practice. And maybe they got into that role because they're doing an excellent job. But oftentimes, people in those roles haven't received training in practice transformation, tracking metrics, affecting change, and utilizing evidence-based practices to drive things forward. So in this certificate program, we do 9 sessions. It's virtual. And they also do a mentored quality improvement project, but it's a little bit lighter and leaner than the Expectations in Quality Academy. There are some people who want to do the postdoctoral research fellowship. So our Progress T32 is funded by ARC, 3 to 4 postdocs per year. And then more recently, we've gotten another award from NHLBI, which we call VISTA. This is specifically targeting hospital and emergency medicine. Across these 2 programs, we've started doing something differently. As I mentioned, rather than allowing the postdocs to work on whatever they want to work on, we try to pair them into health system priority initiatives as much as possible to enhance that synergy which we're trying to build organizationally. And all of our participants in these training programs, as well as anybody else at the medical center who wants to, comes and attends an annual Learning Health System Symposium. So I started this symposium 6 years ago. This is our program from last year. It's offered every May, and it brings together over 100 people from the campus. And very intentionally, people from the research side, the operations, and clinical leadership are all invited. And there's a poster session, keynote, and 2 panels talking about contemporary topics in learning health system research that are going on at that time across the medical center. Another thing that's leveraged a lot of these collaborations is participating in PCORI's Health Systems Implementation Initiative. So here, my partner from Quality, Jenny Slayton, and I co-lead this. We are building capacity across our operational programs to enable more regular and rigorous evaluation of health system initiatives. The training program, EQUIC, that I mentioned before, was part of our capacity building here. And we're also spinning up implementation strategies so that they can be rapidly deployed as we carry out projects. One of the things PCORI required us to do, which has actually been quite nice, is to create a governance structure for this. So this is another way we've built collaboration between the implementation side and the health system leadership. Our highest level clinical executive committee is the governance group for our participation in this initiative. So we present to them regularly. We get their support for initiatives that we want to apply for, and we keep them involved. And they actually nominate people to participate in our quality training program. So giving them a voice and bringing things to them regularly is another part of that synergy developing. So with all that going on, you may say, isn't that enough? But really, a lot of it was extramurally funded and in many ways investigator driven. As much as I've talked about how it's trying to synergize with the health system needs, still a lot of that work is driven by academic scientists in one way or another. So in that context, we felt like there was probably something else we should be doing. And so we did a strategic planning process about a year and a half ago, in which through a series of one-on-one interviews with health system leaders, we identified gaps and opportunities so that we could continue to build our learning health system infrastructure. What we found is that our health system leaders said, you know, it would be really nice to have a place to bring our projects for input. We have that for our researchers. Our CTSA offers things called studios, which are basically focus groups for academic research projects. But a health system leader can't really come to that because it's kind of pointy-headed research stuff. And what they really want is somebody practical who can give them advice. And so we needed to create that infrastructure. Also, they wanted help selecting metrics and developing more rigorous evaluation strategies, but ones that would be feasible to carry out on their timeline. We did a formal SWOT analysis as part of this, and really the key opportunities were that if we could create some synergies, more in service to the health system, that would be a good complement to a lot of the strengths that we already have. So performing that strategic planning process actually coincided really nicely with the beginning of a new center grant, which we call Rapid LHS. This is funded through ARC and PCORI's E-STAR initiative, which funds a number of learning health system programs around the country. And our goals here were to continue training people in learning health system science and develop core services so that we could support the health system projects, either with initial consultations or ongoing collaborations. The consult services I won't talk about too much. They are what you would expect. Somebody can fill out a form, request a consult. We pull together 5 or 6 people, talk with them for an hour, try to answer whatever questions they have. Maybe it's about designing something differently or adapting it or developing an evaluation strategy. But it's really intended to be a one-time provision of input, not unlike what I understand the Learning Health System Core here provides. They can come back to us if they're at a different stage of the project and maybe they need input on something else. We have standing people who have agreed to participate in this, and in dark blue here are the methods that they represent. And we also have a bench of other people with specific expertise that we may need to call on depending on what the ask is, and their expertise are represented in the unshaded blocks here. We've got a project manager, a process for developing a project plan and deliverables. And our goal is to, sorry, I got ahead of myself. We got a project manager who keeps all this together, and we try to make this as efficient as possible for providing input. Some projects, though, rise above that, and their health system priorities. And that's where we've created a new mechanism to provide collaboration services. So for that, a couple of us look across a portfolio of projects going on at the medical center. We select things that we think might be impactful and present that to a review panel that includes several health system leaders, and they help us prioritize how much effort to spend on those different projects. We have some internal funding to support these collaborations as part of building our synergy between research and operations. We start them out with a consult, an initial workshop, but then we develop a project plan with them. We come up with a deliverable, which might be a study design, it might be a paper about something that's already happened. And we work with them often at a cadence meeting every 2 weeks to help carry out this project plan. And one of our goals is to disseminate the products of the work, the innovations that are going on in the medical center all the time. We had to create a way to prioritize this work, and so we used the mnemonic RAPID, which also goes with our center grant, Rapid LHS. It has to be a priority, relevant topic for the health system. There has to be somebody academically who has that interest, who's aligned with that. There are certain things that we're just not well suited to take on. There needs to be a patron. There's already a health system team management structure around this. We're not going to take over managing a health system initiative. We're going to work with them to bring academic input to it. So it's important that they already have an infrastructure and that whatever's going on is impactful, either in terms of impact of the health system or the patients, and also that we can do it fairly quickly. We've done about a year's worth of collaborations, and it's really been wonderful to see it span across the entire clinical enterprise. We've done just one-time consultations with about 7 projects, and about 11 collaborations are ongoing. Some of those we've been able to bring in an academic scholar who's funded by the center grant or one of these T32s to provide some extra time, and it's a great career opportunity for them too. And in other cases, one of our senior learning health system scientists provides the steering for that process. We have a biostatistician and a project manager who really helps execute a lot of the work. Over the course of this talk, I hope I've given you several examples of ways in which we've tried to build synergy academically and operationally. This is still growing, and it doesn't exist in any one place. I don't think we have a learning health system. We have what I call an ecosystem. A lot of these entities were already up and running, but part of their activities relate to learning health systems, and so we try to build collaboration with them. behind each of these blocks here is actually a number of specific programs. And by no means are we able to get synergy across everything, but over time and through specific projects, more and more connections get made so that overall, especially in the last 2 years, I feel like we've changed the culture towards having more regular expectations for the academic and health system collaborations as we continue to grow as a learning health system. So with that, I will pause and look forward to your questions.
Does this work? It is excellent. I'm going to start. Do we have any questions here in the room? All right, I'll just run right over here.
Great talk. Thank you, Sunil. You talked a lot about getting the frontline staff involved in the health system, but how did you go about convincing the C-suite that you were really, this was a value to them and going to create value for the health system overall, particularly as you're trying, some of those early ERIS and Propel looked like, well, they're going to disrupt standard workflows, they're going to change potential costs and risks. And I was just curious, that seems to be a barrier that a lot of learning health systems run into.
Right. That's a great question, and it's really critical to have that high-level buy-in. I think we've had two things really going for us. Well, probably three. One is that our health system and the academic research programs are part of the same leadership structure. They roll up to the same person. And while there are different people managing each side of that enterprise, there's a sense of shared purpose because of the organizational structure. The second thing is we have a lot of ringers. Our chief of staff is also the department chair of anesthesiology. Our hospital CEO completed the University of Cincinnati Improvement and Implementation Science training. People in positions of leadership have had a long-standing view that this type of work is important. Not everyone, but enough of them that it makes those conversations easy to get those allies, and then everybody else, can join. And the third thing is we're pretty intentional about bringing them in. For example, we have an executive steering committee for our CTSA pragmatic trials work, which very deliberately includes the hospital CEO, chief nursing officer, head of pharmacy, and many other leaders from the C-suite level, so they can hear about the work going on and offer their support for it.
Great. We had a question in the chat about how much of this work you've extended beyond your health system, so for community work, and what you've done to address some of the barriers in kind of making that leap from your system to the broader community.
Yeah. So most of the work has been focused within our health system. One example of an area where it's growing, which is also supported by one of these PCORI health system implementation initiatives, is around antimicrobial stewardship. So in that case, we have about 70 pediatric practices. Many of them are academic. Many are in the community. But we have included a large, diverse, heterogeneous set of practices to be part of that implementation program to try to make sure we're providing appropriate care for children who present with respiratory tract infections. So I think individual projects where those opportunities are there to do something at scale, it really makes a lot of sense to include the community partners. An area I'd like to see develop is now that we have some regional hospitals that are part of our health system, we're starting to talk about ways to do some parallel work there, but we haven't quite got there yet.
Great. I think I've covered all of the questions from the chat. One of the things that did come up, and we had a couple of people just comment on, was your mention of human factors engineers. Yeah. And I'm curious who those folks are, and if you could talk a little bit about those roles.
Yeah. So we've had a longstanding group called the Center for Research and Innovation in System Safety, which was founded and has been led by Matt Wanger, who's a anesthesiologist and patient safety expert. He just recently passed the baton to Dr. Nicole Werner, who is a psychologist, human factors expert, who's now leading that center. So within that group, there are 5 or 6 people with expertise on doing direct workflow observation, designing systems for safety, helping to design socio-technical aspects of interfaces. There are people with specific interests in EHR, clinical decision support tools, and things like that. We tap their expertise on grant-funded projects primarily, where we want to do an intensive design. So for example, the Stratify heart failure risk prediction model I mentioned to you incorporated input from those human factors engineers as we were designing and testing that graphic user interface to bring that predictive model into clinical practice. Other cases where we're seeing opportunities to evaluate teamwork in the hospital, for example, also can call on their expertise.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up and give everybody a minute to chat in the room if anybody desires. But thank you all so much for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Kripalani, for making the trip out and sharing all your great work with us.
Thank you. I
Appreciate
enjoyed
it.
it.